So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Follow the River lecture series. I'm Sarah Wasberg Johnson, Director of Exhibits and Outreach here at the Hudson River Maritime Museum. And our lecture series is also sponsored by Rondout Savings Bank. So I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's lecturer, who's Jerry Mikorenda, who will be talking about some of the history behind his new novel, The Whaler's Daughter.
I'm going to start with a little movie here. You see that?
There were 2 whaleboats left on the bay. Neither one of them had room for me.
It's gonna be rough out there today.
Rapunzel better not burn the food. We better not be out there too long.
All at once, I was frightened of what I had done, but I was free. If Papa needed a boy for the boats, I'd meet him halfway.
Take your votes. White means yes, and black means no.
What about the fat?
Dorothy.
Hey you, Missy, are you supposed to stow me? Ed, must be a boy.
I count 6 no's, 8 yes. Get on the boat.
So we just heard part of this, the Wellerman song, which Sarah said was, it went viral, as they say, on TikTok about a year ago. And you saw the trailer that we just finished. I worked with the fine arts program at Five Towns College here on Long Island, and so to give you a little flavor of the book. So now to go in the other direction, I'm really going to talk about the what we call the true story behind The Whaler's Daughter. One writer once said, add imagination to historical facts and you'll have a good story. So I think that's kind of what I did, and I think throughout this you'll see we'll talk about the what it was, what it's like down in Australia, and then you'll see how I applied that to my book. And just to give you a quick synopsis of the book. In 1910, 12-year-old Savannah Dawson lives with her widowed father on a whaling station in New South Wales. For generations, the Dawson's family forged an odd relationship with orcas. They worked together to hunt whales, but Savannah believes the orcas played a dark role in the death of her older brothers. She's desperate to prove to her father that she can carry on their legacy and seek vengeance against their killers. but nobody wants to grow on a whaleboat. That is until Figgy, an Aboriginal boy, helps Savannah hone her whaling skills and learn about the law of the bay. The whaler's daughter will make you laugh, sigh, and sometimes cry. At least that's what people tell me anyway. So when I started this project and I saw a lot of this took place in Australia, I'm like, oh yeah, Outback Steakhouses, right? Well, obviously, Australia's a lot more than Outback Steakhouses. And in fact, it's the sixth largest country in the world. And if you look at these three maps, particularly here, you can see back in the time period that I'm talking about, they had 6 territories, which I guess we would compare to states today. But you can also see how large it is. I mean, here's most of Europe fits down in this area of, small part of Australia, and the US is about 25% larger than Australia. So quite a big place. It has 5 time zones. Their seasons run opposite to ours. So we're now coming into fall and winter. They're coming into spring and summer. It was discovered by Europeans, and we put that in quotes, in 1522, because there are plenty of people already there. They just, weren't from Europe. And it only became a part of the British Commonwealth in 1901, as its own country. So a lot of my, most of my story, I'd say almost all of it, takes place here in Twofold Bay. In my book, I call it Reflect Bay. And you can see how the bay is almost divided in half. And the fellow who named it, his name was George Bass. He saw that Calais Bay, this upper half you see here, and Nautica Bay almost looked the same. So he called them it's like two halves. So Twofold Bay. This is how they got its name. It just happens to be the 3rd deepest natural harbor in the Southern Hemisphere. I think it's at least 120, maybe feet deeper, 4 or 5 miles across. So it's huge. And of course, it's a great feeding ground for whales on their trek to Antarctica. And that's where the whaling comes in. And you can see on this end, there is the city or the town of Eden. Over here, where the Kaya Inlet is the Davidson Whaling Station. And in my book, that's the Dawson Whaling Station. So we have orcas or killer whales. What are they? It really depends on your perspective. And what I wanted to do with all this collage of drawings, is the photos rather, is show the real depth of what these animals do. They are acrobatic. They take care of their young. They go around they go in pods. They're curious about their environment, but also, as you can see from our poor seals sitting here, they can be ferocious killers. And if you saw this open mouth coming toward you in the water, you would be terrified. However, I don't think ever in the history of the world there's anything with a killer whale attacking a human out in the wild. Of course, in captivity, that's another story. But these whales, because of the way they look, have always put fear into mankind. And just to give you an idea, the many different cultures that have less than stellar names for them. Norway, they're called blubber choppers. Portugal, assassin whale. Germany, murder whale. The Inuit call them the feared one. In Spain, they call them a whale killer. And if you look back in the 15th to maybe through 17th century, most sailors were Spanish that were out on these boats. And whale killer is the name that sticks, and it gets flipped over to killer whale. So people have this inborn fear of these animals. And just to give you a little more of what I consider fun facts about them, and maybe put a little different perspective. Orcas are actually from the dolphin family. They can grow to 32 feet long and 22,000 pounds. And I think if you go back 100 or 200 years ago, I think they were even larger than that. They can live for up to 100 years and are in every ocean in the world. Orcas form pods of up to 50 that are multi-generational. Orcas teach communication and hunting skills to younger members, and they distinguish one pod's culture from another. The pods often have their own distinctive calls and dialects to communicate. And in fact, I've seen pictures and read articles where several pods will get together and go for a hunt. They'll have a hunt, they'll get the fish they want, and then they'll separate very much the way human tribes do, and the way communities live. And I've also seen them disguise and camouflage themselves with say a seal skin, get up close to seals, and then they attack them. So they're really very human. And if you look at here, there are 4 different types, and they're very identifiable. They're almost like human individuals, where you can tell them. A lot of the whalers would see their scars and recognize them through their scars or the unique shape of their dorsal fins here. Also, they have this gray saddle patch on the back and their eye patch here. So they're as distinctive looking, if you look at them closely, as humans are. And of course, you can't talk about whaling unless you talk about whaleboats, right? So, and I think a lot of people look at whaleboats, oh, you know, they're those quaint things from the past. But if you go back to the 19th century, these were highly technological inventions. And right here, we have a painting that an Australian artist did in I think it was 1867, of an actual whale hunt on Twofold Bay. And you can see in this whaleboat how it had that lattice work. And if you're familiar with Viking ships, whaleboats are based and built the same way the Viking ships were. That's why they're so sturdy, and they're able to be out in storms, and they have maneuverability. And everybody on the whaleboat has something different to do. And usually when a whaleboat would go out, somebody in one of the boats would yell out, "Dead whale" or "a stove boat," which if you translate that into our kind of English, it's like either we get the whale or the whale's going to get us. And it was not really, you know, as today when humans go out and do things, that it's kind of a done deal that we're going to win, and it's almost like going to a day at work. But then it wasn't. I mean, there was a good chance that the whales would get the whales, and a lot of them died while we were doing it. So it was very, very intense and deadly work. And here you can see that the different. I wrote it. I won't go into too much detail, but every oarsman and every person on the boat had multiple things to do, that, and where they sat was very important on the boat. The boat steerer was always in the back. He was usually also the harpooner, and he ran the rudder. In the front, the bow rider would direct the boat. The oarsmen always had their back. They never saw where they were rowing. They had to rely on the bow rider to tell them how to go and how fast to row. And when they got close enough to a whale where they wanted to throw the harpoon, they would switch sides. The boat steerer would go up front, and the bow rider would come to the back. And once that harpoon went in, you can see this here. This is a big tub of rope. It's about 900 fathoms, with maybe about 1,500 to 2,000 feet of rope. You see the same thing in this diagram, and that would sizzle through the middle of the boat. And if they didn't, the tub oarsman here, which my character in the book ends up being, if they didn't pour water on it, the rope would catch fire and there'd be a fire in the boat, or the rope would just snap. And these things here, you see, these are called chock pins. And those are usually, there isn't one here, but they're here, and they're all along the boat to keep that rope down. And they're used in other places on the boat. And whenever a whale is caught, a whaler would get a chock pin as a kind of a momentum that showed, hey, this guy killed a whale, and they would put it into their shirt, button hole, and they would wear it around town, and that was like a signal. That was almost like like a medal you could wear in those days. So whale boats were where they pretty much lived, and then sometimes they were caught. You can see there's a sail there. They would be out on the water for days, maybe separated from the ship, but that wasn't the case for the Australian whalers. Now, I mentioned the whaling stations early on, and if you're like me, when you went to school and you read Moby Dick, you say, oh yeah, whalers, they go out on whale ships for a couple of years and they come back after killing whales with a bunch of oil. Well, in Australia, they didn't have to do that. The whales came to them. So they didn't need an expensive boat with a crew that was going to be out for a number of years. They could just go out into Twofold Bay, find a whale, bring the carcass back, and then process it on land. So these whaling stations grow up in Australia. They're almost like boutique industries. Small groups of people gather and build their own little village, if you will, right on the water. And a whole village builds up around them. Of course, you need blacksmiths and all this other stuff. So that's kind of the way, a lot of the way that Australia gets settled. In 1828, Thomas Rain starts the first whaling station on Twofold Bay. And here are just a few of the whaling stations I found pictures of. I mean, between Australia, New Zealand, and Tasmania, I bet you there were over 100 whaling stations at one point. But here you have a picture of the Albany station that was still processing and killing whales in the 1950s. There's a base station here also on Twofold Bay that was going into the 20th century. And of course, the Davidson station that is now part of a national park in New South Wales. And down here, you'll see these two big pots. They're called tripods. And when they process the whale, they really call it trying out the whale, which was cutting it into blubber and putting it in these pots and melting it almost like butter. And during the 1840s, a fellow, Benjamin Boyd, a Scotsman, who had a lot of money, he saw that the whaling business was upcoming in Australia. So he goes down there with his money. He starts 14 of these stations. He ran 9 whaleboats. It was sort of like a whaleman maybe before Weller started his whaling ships. And he also tried to start Boydstown across from Eden, where my in my book the Dawson station is. But unfortunately, Boyd was a cad and a con man, and he pressed indigenous islanders to work for him. And if you know anything about the War of 1812, the British were basically taking American soldiers, sailors off of their ships and saying, you're now going to be working for the British government, and if you don't like it, forget it. But for these people, he was almost making them slaves, and the British government wasn't going to stand for that. So he got himself in a lot of trouble. He overbuilt and overpromised, but he convinced the carpenter, Alexander Davidson, to move his family from Scotland to New South Wales. And eventually he's kicked out of, Boyd's kicked out of Australia, and he goes to take over another island. Today, we know it as Guadalcanal, but he is killed there by the islanders. And I think his shrunken head is hanging in a museum somewhere right now. But in 1857, Davidson buys a lot of the whaling equipment off of him to start his own whaling station. And so here you can see, I found some photos of the Davidsons. And here's Alexander Davidson, the patriarch of the family. His son John next, and then he has 2 sons, Archer and Fearless George. And Fearless George is the one most closely associated with Old Tom, who we'll be talking about. And when Davidson starts his station, unlike the other Europeans, he's not adverse to hiring the Aboriginal crews from the Yuin people to help him hunt whales. And they find out very shortly, as you can see down with this photo here, a picture of Old Tom with Fearless George and his Aboriginal crew in a boat with him, that the Yuin people already had this symbiotic relationship with the orcas, and it came from ancient times, and I'm talking like maybe 10,000 years before, where these people who lived on the shoreline during times of famine, they noticed that and usually the winter, that these orcas would chase whales toward the shore. The whales would beach themselves. They would only eat a small part of it and leave the rest for these people. So they felt like it was a gift from heaven. And so over time, this relationship develops where these tribes went out in these dugout canoes and helped the orcas bring the whales into the shore. And these tribes revered the orcas as reincarnated tribal members reborn from the dream time to help them out. And when European explorers come here, they say that these folks were able to call to the orcas, and they would come to shore almost like if you called a dog or a falcon. So it was they were in awe of that. And one of the drawbacks of the whaling stations is, unlike a whaling ship that had a mast of 100 feet high with a crow nest at the top where they could look out, see where the whales were, you can't see that on shore. You'd have to get up in a tree or a tower. But the Davidsons had a secret weapon, because the orcas told them when the whales were coming into the harbor. And that brings us to the story of Old Tom. As I mentioned, the pact with the Huon people and the orcas is now with the Davidsons as they're hunting whales. And just to show you how much of a pact it is, the Davidsons decided to paint their boats tartan green. And you may say, well, they were Scottish. That kind of makes sense. But the reason they did it was so the orcas could find them on the bay. So these orcas were smart enough to see, oh, those are white boats, those are blue boats. We want the green boats. And so that's how they knew who to follow and who to find. And they also, as I mentioned earlier, because of the distinctive look of these dorsal fins and other things, they were able to name the orcas. And here's a picture of Old Tom. You can see he has a very distinctive dorsal fin, and you can tell that's his fin right there as well. And so they were named, so the whalers named the orcas as well, just like they did all their friends. So you had Old Tom, as I mentioned, Hooky, Humpy, Youngster, Stranger, Cooper, Jackson, Young Ben, Little Jack. And you notice the last few names are human names. And whenever a whaler died, whether it was in the line of duty or of natural causes, they named one of the orcas in the pod after him as a way to honor both. And Old Tom is the one, the orca who was the most active with the whalers, but he wasn't the pod leader. The pod leader was the female Stranger. She was the largest orca in the group. But Old Tom ends up being the intermediary between the orcas and the whalers. And when the whales are out, either feeding in Twofold Bay or passing by, the orcas would somehow get the word to Old Tom. And Old Tom swam to the mouth of the Kaya River. In my book, it's called the Echo River, leaping and slapping his tail to get the attention of the whales. It was almost like an alarm going off. So the whales would hop into their whale boats and start rowing out. And if they weren't rowing fast enough, the orcas would bump their boats, and they would throw a lasso out almost like you would to a horse, and they pulled them to the spot where the whales were, so we'd get there on time. And if a whaleboat was smashed during a hunt, which often happened, the orcas protected the men from the sharks, because when there's blood in the waters in Australia, there's definitely going to be sharks. And so once the whale was killed and they pulled it in to the inlet where the whaling station was, they anchored the carcass with a buoy, and they left it for the orcas. So the orcas got their part first, and when the orcas were finally done, they pulled it ashore and they processed the whale. And they found out the only things that the orcas really ate were the tongue and the lips of these whales. So they must have had some real nutritional value, because it was like gold to these animals. And so Davidson ends up calling the pact the law of the tongue. And in my book, I call it the law of the bay, and I make it a little more inclusive of other things as well. And so here we have Old Tom is really the one who's going back and forth with them. And again, just to underline how much of a relationship they had versus just working together. As the 20th century approaches and they're getting these mechanized whaling ships with powerized cannon-like harpoons that allow them to kill more whales, the Davidsons never go that direction, because they say the noises hurt the ears and the sonar of the orcas. So they didn't want to do that. So they said, we're sticking to the ancient way of hunting, even if it means we're not going to get as many whales. And in 1923, right after they kill a whale and there's a storm coming in, Old Tom sort of starts to fight them and says, no, we need to get our part now. And the whalers say, well, we're going to lose the whale. We got to bring the whale in. So there's a little bit of a tug of war going on. And during it, Old Tom loses a number of teeth, and he's never quite the same. He doesn't go away, but he only lives another 7 years. And on September 17th, 1930, they found his body floating in Twofold Bay. And here's a picture of Fearless George on top of his body. And it was like a member of their family died. They were just in grief. They were besides themselves. So they decide, well, what we need to do is preserve him. So they take all the rotting flesh off of his bones, and they're not scientists, but they put him back together, not missing any bones at all. And they preserve him, and they put him in a barn. It's kind of a shrine, and people come to see this from all over. And the rest of that pod in 1930 kind of disappears. They either killed by commercial whalers, or they just left because they felt that the pact was broken. And nobody sees orcas now then for 80 years. But suddenly I read this article and I couldn't believe this when I read it. In 2010, on September 17th, 3 orca pods show up in Twofold Bay for the first time in 80 years. And then all they hear is these mournful sounds. And people said this was almost like they came, it was like a memorial for old Tom. And I just thought that was pretty extraordinary. And so here you can see the old barn ends up becoming over time this killer whale museum in Eden, New South Wales, that you can see down at the bottom here. And here's old Tom skeleton that they saved all those years ago. And people come from all over the world to see to see him. And here you can see a close-up of his teeth and how how they got ruined. And I guess when he died, the Davidsons thought that he was about 90 years old. But when they did tests recently on his teeth, because they have better ways to date these animals' lives, they found that he was only about 30 years old. So maybe they should call him Young Tom. But as they say, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. So I'll stick to calling him Old Tom. And so that's about it. And these are just some scenes from, when I write about things, I like to get a good idea of what I'm writing about and what things look like there. So I compile these photos of kind of a collage of things I wrote about in the book, and I'll just briefly tell you a little about it. So for instance, here in the center, this is kind of what I think, the inlet looks like. I mean, it's beautiful, but also there are sandbars, there's rip currents, so there's beauty, but there's also beneath the water treachery. You have beautiful evenings with the southern lights from Antarctica over the line over there. There's a lot of different kind of boats going back and forth across Twofold Bay, Reflect Bay in my book. And yes, we have a horse and a horse race in the book. My main character has about 8 cats. And yeah, lots of animals in this book, no question about it. Up here, you see a bunch of pelicans in a house. The pelican house is the old seafarer's home. And this is a scupper plug that they would pull to drain water from the deck of a boat. And it becomes one of the ones from one of the original ships there becomes a kind of a cup or a prize for the whalers and the fishermen whenever they have a cricket match, an annual cricket match. And of course, you can't have a sea story without a storm. So you can see this is a big whopper coming in, and there are a number of storms in my book as well. And down there, they don't call them hurricanes, they're called cyclones. And of course, plenty of orcas with a lot of personalities in the book. And so now to finish, I thought what I would do is Kay Brady, who plays Savannah, you saw her in the trailer. She read the first chapter of my book. It's about an 8-minute read, so it's not too long. But I think now that the things that you've learned when you hear about the book, when you hear it in the book, I think it'll make a little more sense for you. And also, you'll hear a few terms you probably don't understand. But in the back of my book, I have a glossary of Australian and nautical slang. So hopefully that'll help. So now I'll play that if I can figure out how to do it. Which is, let's see, shrink this. Here we go.
Part 1, the chalk pin. There were only 2 whaleboats on the bay. Neither one of them had room for me. I began my day as I always did, lugging those dreaded pots to the fire pit to make a bushman's stew. Their big iron bellies slogged through the sand as if they were drunken sailors being dragged to Sunday service. I set them on the coals, dropping my gunny sack of victuals to climb the dunes looking out over the water. Low tide stretched the sandbars into the bay. I pulled my shawl tight against the breeze and removed my cooking bonnet. The wind lifted my hair across my face. I listened to the familiar sounds of oars locking, feet stomping, and wood slapping water. I gathered in my long, billowing tresses from below my waist and held them like an infant in my arms. The crew rowed past without the slightest notion I was there, cooking their meal. Lon stood in the nearest boat, waving his oar like a cricket bat to belly laughs. My whole life I had heard that the Dawson name meant something, that a Dawson's word was trusted and their skills unquestioned. I cupped my hands around my mouth and yelled out at the boats, "Well, I'm a Dawson." But the waves licked my words out of the air and everything went quiet. I glanced over to where the Echo River flowed into the Reflect Bay. Dawson Station lay there like a rotting fish in the sand. On the far end sat the Try-Works, with its caved-in brick furnace and rusty cauldrons that turned Bible-sized slabs of whale blubber to oil every autumn. The bunkhouses lay a quarter-mile away from our Highland castle, Loch Bultera, a name that made no sense and sounded more important than it was. Beyond the family graves, smoke from the village huts clung to the hills. It was all dying the slow, painful demise of neglect.
Sorry, guys, gave you the wrong one. That's all right. We'll pick it up here.
Pot into one pot and slammed the iron lid down onto the other. I ripped a still wiggling eel out of the bag. Its long neck flopped up and down on the chopping block as the crew's hoots and hollers bellowed across the water. "I ain't no cook, and what's fair is fair," I shouted, whacking the large round center of the eel and snapping it into a pot with my blade. "It's my birthright to be a part of the hunt as much as any of them." I kicked a bag of duff into one pot and slammed the iron lid down onto the other. I salted the open pot, then plopped down onto a dune. A glint of sun caught Brennan's cleaver, winking at me where it had struck upright in the chopping block. The boats were off in the distance, out of earshot now, and the curtains were drawn closed inside the widow's walk. I walked over to the wooden stump and sank to my knees in front of it. I ran a finger along the edge of the cleaver. I brushed off what dried guts remained on the block and placed my face next to the blade. Brushing back my hair, I could see my reflection on the shiny flat steel. Papa had removed all the mirrors in the house years ago. The light shadows on the walls where they had once hung were the only footprints left that showed they'd ever existed. I studied the reflection of the scars on my right cheek. The deep, bumpy crevices reminded me of gullies after a storm. I ran my finger down the terrain of my cheek and then along the razor-sharp edge of the blade. I flinched as my blood mixed with all that went into the pots. Then I pried the cleaver loose from the wood with the twisting sound of bones cracking and grabbed a fistful of my hair, laying it across the block. I lifted the blade as high as I could and brought it down. Again and again, the blade swung left, right, up, and down. Large chunks of my hair fell next to me as I slashed and slashed again. When I couldn't cut any more on the block, I stood and hacked as much as I could pull. It tangled in my hands as if it were trying to bind me, but I continued to slice and cut and rip until I grabbed for hair and there was nothing but air to hold. The breath rushed out of me as the cleaver fell to the sand. I felt the coolness of the offshore breeze on the back of my neck, tickling the jagged haystacks of hair sticking out of my head. All at once, I was frightened of what I had done, but I was free, too. If Papa needed a boy for the boats, I'd meet him halfway.
So if you guys have any questions, I'll take them.
Thanks, Jerry. That was great.
Thanks.
I don't think we have any questions in the chat yet, so I'm going to go ahead and let people unmute themselves if they want to ask questions verbally. We can do that too.
Should I take
I have a question for you. And I don't remember if you addressed this in the early part of your talk, but how did you come across the story and what made you decide to turn it into a book?
Well, believe it or not, it was actually a TV show. There was back in 2009, PBS did a show called The Killers of Eden. And that just, I was just knocked on the floor by it. So I can't believe this. So, you know, I started doing a little research. I said, wow, this is unbelievable. And it stayed that way for a couple of years. And then, you know, I was thinking of writing a couple of books. And then finally I said, you know, there's a story to tell here. And here it is. And like I said, it really is, you know, I wasn't kidding. It is based on what happened there. And so